The garden at St. Mary Mead Rectory glowed in the June sunshine, transformed by Mrs. Prothero's diligent hands into an oasis of summer elegance. Climbing roses bordered the hedges trimmed with military precision, and round tables were strategically placed on the freshly cut lawn, each covered with white linen tablecloths and crowned with wildflower arrangements. Paper lanterns awaited the arrival of dusk, when they would cast their golden light upon what promised to be the most important social event of the season at St. Mary Mead, the annual summer ball for the benefit of church repair. Miss Jane Marple, who in her 70s had perfected the art of discreet observation, adjusted her lavender cotton gloves and surveyed the scene with an expression of serene approval. Her pale blue, elegantly old-fashioned dress allowed her to blend into the crowd, while I took in every detail the way the young curator, Mr. Edmund Blackwood, avoided eye contact with the beautiful Mrs. Catherine Ashford, how the fingers of Blackwood's wife, Mrs. Millison, trembled imperceptibly as she held her champagne glass, and the peculiar expression of barely concealed calculation on the face of the wealthy merchant, Mr. Victor Pemberton, as he regarded the charming daughter of the late Lady Ashford. The three-piece orchestra violin, a cello, and an accordion began to play a cheerful tune. The first couples made their way to the makeshift dance floor at the far end of the garden, and Miss Marple settled herself in a wicker chair next to Mrs. Prothero, who was already busy mentally cataloguing every detail of the evening for next month's gossip. "What a lovely affair, Mrs. Prothero," remarked Miss Marple, without taking her eyes off the garden. "It must have required a considerable amount of effort." Mrs. Prothero stood up with satisfaction. "Indeed, Miss Marple, although I must confess it hasn't been without its complications. Suppliers have been particularly troublesome this year, and some of our major sponsors have shown a curious reluctance to make their usual contributions." Miss Marple tilted her head with genuine interest. "Really? And to what do you attribute this reluctance?" "Well," lowered Mrs. Prothero, leaning towards Miss Marple, "it all began when news of Mr. Pemberton's engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashford reached people. You can imagine the news has caused a certain unease in certain circles. Mrs. Millicent Blackwood, in particular, has been more than displeased. Her husband, the curator, and Miss Ashford have been working together on cataloguing the church collection for the last few months. Mrs. Blackwood, I believe, had higher hopes for her marriage." "How natural," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. "One person's misfortune is, for another, an opportunity to rearrange their affections." The band played louder, and lively music filled the perfumed air. More guests arrived every moment. The town doctor, Dr. Harrison, with his nervous wife, the mayor and his large family, several local landowners with their respective spouses, and, at the center of everyone's attention, Mr. Victor Pemberton with his newly announced fiancée, the dazzling Miss Eleanor Ashford. Eleanor was certainly charming, deep chestnut brown hair, pale blue eyes, and a figure that made men completely forget their manners. Her ivory silk dress, recently arrived from London, was clearly from a high-class dressmaker. As she passed Miss Marple, the latter could perceive the delicate scent of lilacs that clung to her, but it was the face of Edmund Blackwood, the young curator, that captured Miss Marple's full attention. When Eleanor passed by, his eyes followed her with an intensity that could not be entirely hidden, even by someone less observant than Miss Marple. And when Eleanor took Mr. Pemberton's arm, Edmund looked as if he had physically punched her. "A love triangle," Miss Marple muttered to herself, though not even out loud. Mrs. Prothero continued chattering. oblivious to Miss Marple's thoughts. Mr. Pemberton is 50. If that's a day, of course, but he's extremely wealthy. He inherited a considerable fortune from the textile trade, you see. Although there are those who whisper that his business methods haven't always been exactly honest. In any case, Eleanor Ashford is an excellent match for him. She comes from a good family, though their financial situation is somewhat limited at the moment. Her father died 3 years ago, and her mother just 18 months ago. There should be an inheritance, of course, but it seems matters are more complicated than anyone would expect. Miss Marple nodded slowly, integrating this information into the complex tapestry she was mentally weaving. A needy heiress, a wealthy man eager to marry, a young curator with eyes that betrayed unrequited love, a neglectful wife whose husband ignored her, and oddly, a reluctance to contribute financially to the church on the part of people who were usually generous. Tell me. Mrs. Prothero, said Miss Marple with her characteristic kindness, is there anything else that is troubling you about tonight's preparations? There seems to be a slight tension in your expression. Mrs. Prothero hesitated for a moment, then continued. Well, if you must know, Miss Marple, there has been a little incident. Mr. Pemberton's butler, a man named James Cordell, asked his employer for a considerable sum of money a week ago. Apparently, he was refused rather rudely. The young man was furious, though he has carried on with his duties ever since. Some suggest that Mr. Pemberton dismissed him, but Cordell continues to appear at social events, albeit as a guest rather than a servant. Interesting, observed Miss Marple. A change of circumstances can reveal a great deal about a person's character. The orchestra was now playing a waltz, and couples were twirling under the first stars that were beginning to shine. The garden, now illuminated by the lanterns that had been lit, had an air of almost supernatural charm, and Miss Marple, with her decades of experience observing the secrets of small towns, knew with the certainty that only age and contemplation can bestow, that Mrs. Prothero's perfect garden concealed mortal imperfections at 9 o'clock sharp, when most of the guests were deep in dancing and carefree conversation. Miss Marple decided to withdraw from the central bustle of the garden. Her feet, though accustomed to walking the winding paths of St. Mary Mead, were beginning to remind her of her age, and she found solace on the wooden bench beside the small ornamental pond at the far end of the rectory garden. From there, the dancing looked like a living painting, dancing lights, silhouettes moving to the rhythm of the music, and the assurance that she could observe without being observed. She wasn't alone for long. Edmund Blackwood, the young curator, appeared from behind the hedges about 10 minutes after Miss Marple had settled in. His arrival was not accidental. He walked purposefully, though his expression suggested he was seeking solitude. He seemed surprised to find Miss Marple already occupying the bench, but politely attempted to withdraw. Please don't leave on my account. When they rushed back to the main garden area, they found a scene of contained chaos. Mr. Pemberton was standing in the middle of the dance floor, his face flushed with both anger and embarrassment at the public attention. Mrs. Prothero was attempting to restore order, suggesting that Eleanor had probably retreated to the ladies' quarters. But Mrs. Pemberton's insistence, along with the fact that several maids had already checked these areas, indicated that something more serious was afoot. Perhaps he went outside for some fresh air, suggested Dr. Harrison, though his tone suggested that even he didn't believe this explanation. Without telling anyone, without her coat, Mr. Pemberton asked with a coldness that made those present shudder. Eleanor isn't the type of woman to disappear. She knows exactly where she is at all times. Miss Marple watched his reaction with interest. It wasn't the reaction of a panicked man in love. It was the reaction of a man whose prized possession had unexpectedly vanished. "Perhaps I should check the garden moorings more carefully," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Sometimes people may have wandered off the main paths without meaning to cause alarm." His suggestion was sensible, and several men, including the mayor and Dr. Harrison, agreed to spread out and search the darkest corners of the garden. Edmund volunteered with a promptness that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. As the searchers dispersed, Miss Marple stood to one side, watching. She noticed how Mrs. Millicent Blackwood seemed almost pleased with the unfolding drama, how her hand clenched against her champagne glass, how her lips curved slightly upward even though her face tried to project the appropriate concern. He also noticed James Cordell, the former butler, standing in the shadows near the tent containing the refreshments. His expression was one of calculated surprise, but his eyes constantly searched for Mr. Pemberton, studying every change in his former employer's expression. 5 minutes passed. 10. Panic in the meeting was palpably growing. The music had stopped, and Mrs. Prothero was about to call the police when Edmund came running back from the dark end of the garden. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something that wasn't simply surprise. "I've found her," he cried. "In the greenhouse. Someone has. Oh dear, Mr. Pemberton, you must see her immediately." "What do you mean, someone has?" asked Mr. Pemberton, his voice suddenly sharp as steel. "What happened?" But Edmund didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Miss Marple, her young face devastated. "She's dead, Miss Marple. Eleanor Ashford is dead." The silence that followed Edmund's words was absolute. It was as if the garden itself held its breath, as if the night had frozen in a moment of pure disbelief. Then, everything erupted in chaotic motion. Mr. Pemberton lunged towards Edmund, his hands gripping the lapel of the young curator's suit. "What nonsense is she talking about? Dead? How can she be dead? She was dancing with me just 30 minutes ago." "To the greenhouse," Edmund gasped, freeing himself from her grip. "Please, everyone must come. I don't understand what's happened, but she's on the ground. There's blood." Dr. Harrison was the first to move, his medical training overcoming his shock. He made his way immediately to the path leading to the Victorian conservatory in the far corner of the rectory garden. Mr. Pemberton followed, staggering slightly, as if his legs no longer fully responded to his commands. Mrs. Prothero gave a small, stifled cry and grasped the mayor's arm. Miss Marple, however, did not move immediately. Instead, she remained where she was, carefully observing the reactions of those present. It was a deliberate decision, born of decades of understanding human nature. Criminals, in her experience, often revealed themselves most fully in the moments immediately following the discovery of the crime, when shock still clouded their ability to maintain their social facade. Mrs. Millicent Blackwood had paled, but her expression was not one of genuine shock, but rather something closer to calculated dismay. James Cordell had retreated further into the shadows, his face carefully expressionless, though his fists clenched and unclenched repeatedly. And Mrs. Pemberton, the fiancé's wife, seemed to be experiencing a disconcerting mixture of horror and something that, if Miss Marple was not mistaken, resembled a dangerous kind of satisfaction. "We should continue," suggested the mayor gently, having noticed that Miss Marple still hadn't moved. "Dr. Harrison may need assistance." "Yes, of course," agreed Miss Marple. rising with the characteristic dignity of someone who moves according to her own internal timetable. Although I suggest everyone stay on the main path. Crime scenes are notoriously delicate, aren't they? Every footprint, every bit of disarray could be significant. There was an uneasy murmur of agreement, though some of the younger guests seemed eager to get closer to the drama of the situation. Miss Marple walked deliberately slowly, allowing the others to pass her, her mind already weaving patterns from what she had observed. The rectory's conservatory was a beautiful structure of glass and teak, built 3 decades earlier by a former rector whose passion for exotic orchids was legendary at St. Mary Mead. It now served mainly as a storage place for old flower pots, gardening tools, and the less decorative plants that Mrs. Prothero could not bear to see in public. Eleanor Ashford lay among the rows of potted plants, her beautiful ivory silk dress stained with something much darker. One of the gardening tools, a heavy metal pruning shears, lay near her head. Dr. Harrison was leaning over her, hopelessly verifying what was already obvious to everyone. Eleanor Ashford had been dead for at least 15 minutes. The blow to the back of his head had been brutal, concise, and definitely lethal. No one should touch anything, declared Dr. Harrison, his voice taking on the professional authority that his age and experience allowed. We must call the police immediately. This is a serious matter, very serious indeed. Mr. Pemberton was staggering, his face a sickly grey that suggested he might faint at any moment. The mayor's hands shot out to catch him. Who could have done this? The mayor whispered, though more to himself than to anyone in particular. Who in St. Mary Mead could be capable of such violence? Miss Marple entered the greenhouse carefully, allowing her eyes to scan the scene with the systematic precision she had perfected over so many years. The soil and gravel around the body showed signs of a struggle, though not a particularly violent one. There was a shoe print, partially imprinted in the soil, a man's shoe, medium. There were also fibers of fabric near the body, small pieces that might have been torn during a conflict. Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard arrived at St. Mary Mead at approximately 11 o'clock at night, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and his assistant, Sergeant Pembroke. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested he had seen enough of human nature not to be easily surprised. However, when Dr. Harrison briefed him about the crime, even his professional composure showed signs of disturbance. At a charity ball, she asked, as if the information were too absurd to be true. A young woman murdered during a social event in the middle of a seemingly quiet town. Apparently that's the right word, Inspector, replied Dr. Harrison. St. Mary Mead has maintained a facade of bucolic peace for decades. But as you will soon discover, I'm sure, even the quietest villages harbour their own dramas. Inspector Craddock immediately ordered the crime scene secured and all the ball guests in the garden to be kept under police surveillance. It was a sensible decision. No one entered or left the rectory without being searched. Then, with an efficiency that revealed years of practice, he began taking preliminary statements. Miss Marple watched from a garden chair, officially as a mere spectator of the proceedings, but in reality absorbing every detail. She observed as Inspector Craddock began with Mr. Pemberton, whose story was straightforward. Eleanor had been his fiancée, the engagement announced only a week before, and he knew absolutely nothing about her whereabouts after she vanished from the dance floor. "Were you going to get married soon?" asked the inspector. "In 2 months," Mr. Pemberton replied. "We had everything planned. She was a lovely woman, Inspector." I can't imagine who would want to harm her. Inspector Craddock raised an eyebrow, a gesture which Miss Marple found particularly revealing. Didn't they argue about anything? No conflict whatsoever regarding the date, the arrangements, or their respective finances. Mr. Pemberton hesitated for just a moment that was too long. Nothing important, he finally replied. Next, it was Edmund Blackwood's turn. His account was more hesitant, his words punctuated by obvious emotion. He described finding the body, described seeing Eleanor walking toward the back gardens, but was evasive about his own reasons for being in that area. I was simply looking for some fresh air, he insisted, although his eyes did not meet those of Inspector Craddock. Fresh air, the inspector repeated, with an intonation that suggested disbelief. Mr. Blackwood, I have statements from several guests that you seemed particularly troubled for most of the ball. What caused your troubled state? Edmund blushed deeply. Simply, personal matters, Inspector. Nothing to do with Miss Ashford or this terrible crime. But Miss Marple noticed something. When Edmund mentioned Eleanor, his voice wavered, his expression hardened with deliberate control. He wasn't a man merely struggling to maintain his composure over personal matters. He was a man grappling with a significant emotion specifically related to Eleanor. Ashford. Mrs. Millicent Blackwood was called next. Her story was straightforward. She had been playing croquet with other ladies for most of the evening, had seen Eleanor briefly during the dance, but had no idea where the young woman had gone. When asked directly if she had any reason to wish Eleanor Ashford ill, her reply was a little too hasty. No reason at all, Inspector. Why would I have one? That's exactly what I'm trying to determine, Mrs. Blackwood, replied the inspector dryly. James Cordell was then questioned. He freely admitted that he had had a conflict with Mr. Pemberton a week earlier over a matter of borrowed money that had not been repaid. But as for Eleanor Ashford, he insisted that he barely knew her. I had never spoken to her except in social contexts, Inspector. I had no reason to wish her dead. Inspector Craddock gestured to his assistant, who disappeared briefly before returning with a note. The inspector read it, and his expression grew more intense. Mr. Cordell, one of the waitresses, says she saw you talking to Miss Ashford about an hour ago. She says it seemed like quite an intense conversation, although she couldn't hear what was being said. Can you explain that? James Cordell visibly paled. It was probably just social courtesy, Inspector. She must have mentioned something about my previous employment with Mr. Pemberton, and we just chatted. About what, exactly? The inspector pressed. Regarding money, if you need to know, James admitted defensively. I asked her if she could speak to Mr. Pemberton on my behalf, if she could persuade him to be more considerate. She said she would try, though she seemed doubtful. Miss Marple stored this information in her memory, carefully connecting it with everything else she had observed. Finally, Inspector Craddock approached Miss Marple. He seemed surprised to see her still there. Miss Marple, I understand you were one of the last people to see the victim before his death. Can you tell me what you observed? Miss Marple rose gracefully, her eyes clear and bright. Inspector, it was Mr. Edmund Blackwood who informed me of the discovery. However, in the moments just before that event, I observed several details that I believe may be of interest to your investigation. Inspector Craddock took out his notebook. Please continue. Miss Marple, firstly, between 8:30 and 9, when Eleanor disappeared from the ball, there was an important communication between her and James Cordell, exactly as he has just admitted. However, what is particularly interesting is that while they were conversing, I observed Dr. Harrison make a sign to Mr. Pemberton, a sign which Mr. Pemberton seemed to deliberately ignore. The inspector frowned. Dr. Harrison. The town doctor. The same, Inspector. Now, naturally, I cannot know the content of a silent sign, but the intention seemed urgent. Secondly, I observed that Mrs. Millicent Blackwood disappeared from the croquet area for approximately 10 minutes, around 8:45. When she returned, her dress had a small patch of soil on the hem, exactly the kind found in the greenhouse. Inspector Craddock was typing rapidly now. Is there anything else? Yes, Miss Marple continued. In the conservatory, there is a fallen white orchid. It's a rather rare specimen for a conservatory of this type. I would suggest that someone with specific access to an unusual orchid collection may be involved. And finally, Inspector, although this is more speculative, note that Mr. Pemberton and Eleanor had a brief but intense conversation just before she disappeared. Her expression afterwards suggested that some unpleasant things had been said. Inspector Craddock slowly closed his notebook. Miss Marple seems to have a particularly keen eye. 50 years of living in a small town provides a unique education in human nature. Inspector, replied Miss Marple with her characteristic modesty, but as he retreated, his mind was already several steps ahead, weaving the threads of white lies, carefully guarded secrets, and not fully revealed motives into a pattern that was slowly beginning to make sense. The questioning continued well past midnight. Inspector Craddock, demonstrating the persistence that had brought him to his position at Scotland Yard, conducted a second round of more penetrating questions. This time, his inquiries were more specific, more focused, as if Miss Marple's observations had provided direction to his investigation. It was during this second interrogation that Dr. Harrison finally broke down. The inspector called him again, this time with a more accusatory tone. He had discovered something in the house records. Eleanor Ashford had visited Dr. Harrison at his office just 3 days earlier, a visit not recorded in the Edmund didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was implicit in the emotional chaos of the situation. Miss Marple watched all this from her position on the garden bench, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. But her mind was working furiously, reorganizing information, readjusting theories, considering new possibilities. What she had just heard explained much. Edmund's behavior, Eleanor's reticence, Mr. Pemberton's barely contained anger. But there were still gaps, significant gaps. It was then that Mrs. Pemberton advanced towards the inspector. Her face flushed not from embarrassment, but from a fury she had been holding back for years. You want to know who killed Eleanor Ashford? He asked, his voice as harsh as steel. Ask her fiancé about the money that disappeared from his bank a week ago. Ask about the letter Eleanor found on his desk. A letter that linked him to illegal business practices that could have sent him to prison. Mrs. Pemberton, the inspector warned. Be careful with your accusations. These aren't accusations, she replied. They're facts. Eleanor told me. She was scared. She knew that if Mr. Pemberton found out she'd seen that letter, if he knew she was considering telling the authorities, he'd be capable of anything to silence her. The inspector turned to Mr. Pemberton, whose face had turned a deathly grey. Mr. Pemberton, do you have anything to say in response to these accusations? Eleanor was blackmailing me, Mr. Pemberton said, his voice surprisingly calm under the circumstances. Yes, I found Edmund with her. Yes, I discovered her pregnancy. But more importantly, she found documentation suggesting that my business practices haven't been entirely legal. She threatened to expose me unless I agreed to end the engagement quietly and make a substantial transfer of funds to her. And how did he respond? Asked the inspector. I flatly refused, Mr. Pemberton replied. I said that if she dared to expose me, I would make sure her name was dragged through the mud, that her son would be branded a bastard, that she would lose everything she had. It was a nasty conversation, Inspector, but I didn't kill her. Miss Marple, hearing this, realized that something didn't add up. It wasn't simply that Mr. Pemberton was declaring his innocence. It was the pattern of the conversation itself. Eleanor had threatened Mr. Pemberton with exposure, but why would she choose to do so if she was considering marrying him for financial security? Why would she choose to alienate the man on whom her future depended? Unless, thought Miss Marple, she had not expected to marry Mr. Pemberton at all. Inspector, said Miss Marple. Rising again, I have a question for Edmund Blackwood. If you'll allow me. The inspector nodded. Curious, Mr. Blackwood, when Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, did you discuss what to do about it? Edmund seemed surprised by the question. Of course we did. We wanted to get married. We wanted to have our child together. But we were facing financial difficulties. Eleanor insisted that we needed financial security first. And what did you expect her to do about it? Miss Marple continued. She said she knew how to get money. She said she had a plan. She didn't give me details, but she seemed determined. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and then asked the question that changed everything. Did Eleanor have access to exotic orchids, Mr. Blackwood? Did she know anyone who cultivated such plants? Edmund frowned, puzzled. Well, yes. Indeed, her mother had a passion for orchids before her death. She amassed quite a valuable collection. Eleanor inherited most of the plants, though not all. Some were sold or given away after her mother's funeral. And who received some of these plants? Asked Miss Marple, though she knew the answer even before Edmund provided it. Dr. Harrison, Edmund replied. He always admired Eleanor's mother's collection. She gave him several specimens after her death. I think they even talked about him helping her look after them in her own collection. Miss Marple leaned back in her seat, and at that moment, the whole carefully constructed structure of lies and mystery began to unfold before her, revealing patterns and motives that no one else seemed to be considering yet. Inspector Craddock was furiously taking notes, though Miss Marple noticed that his expression suggested he hadn't yet fully grasped the implications of what she was suggesting. It was Sergeant Pembroke who spoke first, his younger mind processing the connections more quickly. The orchid in the greenhouse, he said slowly. Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that Dr. Harrison may have been involved? I am merely suggesting that the presence of a rare orchid in a greenhouse normally containing more common plants is worthy of investigation. Miss Marple replied with careful precision, and that there is a chain of connection between Eleanor Ashford, Dr. Harrison, and that orchid which deserves to be explored. Inspector Craddock stood up abruptly. Dr. Harrison, I need to ask a few additional questions. Specifically, about your relationship with Eleanor Ashford beyond your medical care. Dr. Harrison visibly paled, but tried to maintain his composure. She was my patient, Inspector. Nothing more. So you're denying that she visited him privately, that they discussed matters beyond his physical health? The inspector asked. Eleanor was scared, Dr. Harrison finally admitted. Not just because of her pregnancy, but because of other things. She believed that someone in town was trying to harm her. Who? The inspector asked sharply. She wasn't sure, Dr. Harrison replied, but she had received anonymous notes, warnings about revealing secrets, tacit threats against her safety and the child's. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharpening. What kind of secrets, Doctor? About whom? Dr. Harrison hesitated, and Miss Marple saw the inner conflict play out across his face. Finally, something seemed to crack in his resistance. Not about who, she answered slowly. About what? Eleanor had discovered something in the church records during her cataloguing work. Something she shouldn't have found. Something someone in this town has been hiding for years. The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the night itself were holding its breath. What did you discover? The inspector pressed. Documentation of missing money, replied Dr. Harrison. Church funds that were misappropriated approximately 3 years ago. Large sums, Inspector. Hundreds of pounds. Someone of position in the village has been stealing from the church for years, recording the thefts as legitimate expenses. The mayor jumped up, his face flushed. That's a serious accusation, Doctor. Do you have proof of this? Eleanor had proof, Dr. Harrison replied. The records she found, the numbers that didn't match. She showed them to me, asking if I should report what she had discovered to the appropriate authorities. Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Does this agree with what you observed? Partially, replied Miss Marple. Although I suggest we should consider not only who was stealing from the church, but also who knew that Eleanor had discovered the thefts. For that, Inspector, is the real motive for the murder. And who, according to your observation, knew? Asked the inspector. Several people, Miss Marple replied. First, Dr. Harrison, to whom she showed the records. Second, anyone who saw the records being removed from their usual storage place. And third, anyone to whom Eleanor might have confided her plans about what to do with this information. Miss Marple got up and walked slowly towards Mrs. Millicent Blackwood, who had remained remarkably silent for much of the recent questioning. Mrs. Blackwood, I have a question for you. Do you have any experience cataloguing church records? Mrs. Blackwood paled noticeably. Some, he replied cautiously. I've helped with various administrative tasks for the church over the years. In fact, Miss Marple continued, according to Mrs. Prothero, you were particularly involved in the reorganization of the archives about 3 years ago, just as these funds began to disappear. Wasn't that right? That doesn't mean anything, protested Mrs. Blackwood. But her voice had lost its confidence. Eleanor showed me that note, Miss Marple. I recognized it. The paper was of a particular quality, the kind that could only be obtained from a specific supplier in the nearby town. I had seen it before in Mrs. Blackwood's personal papers. Inspector Craddock signaled to the officers. Mrs. Blackwood, I must ask you to accompany me for a more formal interrogation, and I will need Sergeant Pembroke to examine your room and you for any evidence related to the crime. This is unfair. Mrs. Blackwood protested as the officers led her away. She went to the greenhouse to blackmail me. She threatened to expose me, to ruin my family. I went crazy, absolutely crazy. When I saw her alone, when I saw the opportunity, it just happened. His confession, ripped out by panic and wounded pride, hung in the air like poisonous breath. Edmund Blackwood collapsed, sobbing in Dr. Harrison's arms. Mr. Pemberton remained motionless, his expression complex, as if processing the fact that the woman he had loved, or at least believed he loved, had died at the hands of someone whose guilt was actually quite simple. Inspector Craddock approached Miss Marple, his expression reflecting genuine respect. Miss Marple has solved this case with remarkable accuracy. How did she manage to see what others couldn't? Miss Marple smiled gently. It wasn't difficult, Inspector. I simply observed people the way I observed the plants in Mrs. Prothero's garden. Each one has its own growth patterns, its own needs, its own motivations. And when one pays sufficient attention to these patterns, truths emerge naturally. But as she gazed out into the dark garden, where the music had stopped and the dancing had transformed from a party into a crime scene, Miss Marple reflected on a deeper truth, that even in the quietest villages, violence and passion could sprout like weeds, waiting only for the right circumstances to bloom into tragedy. After the officers took Mrs. Blackwood away, the initial chaos that had reigned in the rectory garden gradually transformed into a stunned silence. The guests who had come to celebrate charity and community slowly departed in small groups, their conversations in whispers as they processed the fact that the murder was not a distant event but something that had happened among them, committed by someone they knew. Inspector Craddock established a temporary command post in the rectory's drawing room, directing his officers in gathering evidence and documenting formal statements. Miss Marple quietly withdrew, knowing her main task was complete. However, she was intercepted by Edmund Blackwood as she made her way toward the front door. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice still trembling but with a quality of despair. "How can anyone go on after this? Eleanor is dead. Our son, he'll never know his mother. How does anyone ever return to normal life after a tragedy like this?" Miss Marple observed him with the eyes of someone who had seen enough of human suffering not to be insensitive to it, but was also wise enough to know that true compassion often required candor. "Normal life? Mr. Blackwood doesn't really exist," she replied. "What we call normal is simply our ability to function within our circumstances, no matter how extraordinary they may be. You will suffer. This is inevitable. But that suffering, in time, can transform into understanding. It can become a motivation to live better, to love more deeply, to value what is in front of you. Your son will need a father who understands that life is fragile. That is a gift you can give him, even though it came through tragedy." Edmund nodded slowly, though his eyes remained clouded by pain. "Do you think I should raise the child? Even though Eleanor and I never married?" "That's a decision only you can make," Miss Marple replied. "But I would say that a child needs love and dedication more than the legitimacy of marriage. If you can provide that, then yes, you should seriously consider it." As Edmund slowly withdrew, Mrs. Prothero approached Miss Marple, her face pale and her usual composure completely dissolved. "Miss Marple, I can't believe it was her. Mrs. Blackwood has been in this church for 15 years. She's served on charity committees. She's provided flowers for the altar. How could someone who seemed so respectable have committed such a horrible act? Violent crimes are seldom committed by people who seem incapable of them," Miss Marple replied. "Psychologists might say they begin with petty transgressions, small thefts that seem justifiable. Then, when a threat to that transgression arises, when someone discovers the truth, the need to protect what one has done can override all moral considerations. Violence emerges as what appears to be the only possible solution. It is a tragedy, certainly, but it is a profoundly human tragedy." "How did he find out?" asked Mrs. Prothero. "How could he see what no one else saw?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "An orchid out of place," Mrs. Prothero, a stain of dirt on a dress. Small details that someone moving quickly under emotional stress might miss. Criminals often think they've covered their tracks, but they can never completely erase them. There's always something that remains, some small reminder of their presence at the scene. If you learn to look carefully, you learn to read these silent stories that objects tell. Mr. Pemberton then approached, his expression difficult to read. He was visibly aged by the events of the night, his typical sophistication replaced by an almost touching vulnerability. "Miss Marple, I have an awkward question to ask," he said. "Did you know? Did you suspect Eleanor's pregnancy before tonight?" "I suspected as much," Miss Marple admitted. Her behavior at the ball suggested a significant worry, a mental burden beyond the ordinary anxieties of a young woman engaged. There was a certain pallor to her complexion that often accompanies the early stages of pregnancy. And when Dr. Harrison made a sign to her, which you apparently ignored, I wondered if perhaps he was trying to warn her of something he knew. "Why didn't you say anything?" asked Mr. Pemberton, though his tone was not accusatory, but genuinely curious. "Because it wasn't my place," Miss Marple replied simply. What Eleanor chose to reveal or not reveal was her decision, not mine. My role tonight was simply to observe and, if a crime occurred, to help the police understand what had happened. It was not to interfere in people's personal affairs unless absolutely necessary for justice. Mr. Pemberton nodded slowly, and then something seemed to break in his composure. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a different look about them, as if he was seeing the world from an entirely new perspective. "I have been a very wrong man, Miss Marple. I have spent my life accumulating wealth, pursuing power, and justifying questionable methods with the excuse that everyone does it. I made Eleanor a marriage proposal based on mutual convenience, not love. And when I discovered she was pregnant by another man, my first instinct was anger, not compassion. If anyone in this town deserves to be accused of a crime, perhaps it is I. The crime you committed was one of pride, Mr. Pemberton, not violence," Miss Marple replied kindly. "That's a crime nearly everyone commits at some point. The real question is what you will do now with this knowledge. Will you retreat to your home to lick your wounds, or will you use this experience to transform yourself into something better?" Mr. Pemberton did not reply immediately, but when he withdrew, there was a more thoughtful look to his expression. Dr. Harrison was the last to approach Miss Marple. She appeared to have aged a decade in the last few hours. "I should have done more," he said bluntly. "Eleanor came to me, terrified. She showed me the church records. She showed me the anonymous notes. I should have made her report everything to the authorities immediately. If I had, she would be alive." "This may be true," Miss Marple agreed. "Or it's possible that even if she had reported the thefts, Mrs. Blackwood, facing imminent exposure, would have found another way to silence Eleanor. Regret is a valid emotion, Doctor, but you mustn't let it paralyze you. What you can do now is look after Edmund Blackwood and help with the upbringing of Eleanor's child. That may be an act of redemption." When Miss Marple finally emerged from the rectory garden into the quiet St. Mary Mead Street, dawn was just beginning to break. The birds were singing, oblivious to the tragedy of the previous night. The village, outwardly at least, looked exactly as it had the morning before, quiet, orderly, and innocent. But Miss Marple knew that innocence, like delicate orchids, was a fragile thing that could be destroyed by the wrong hands. And as she walked toward her little house in the heart of the village, she reflected on how even the most violent crimes often spread. apparently on the grounds that you were instrumental in uncovering the truth of this situation. Would you be willing to visit her in prison?" Miss Marple considered this request carefully, weighing her obligations to justice against her understanding of human nature. "Do you think she's trying to manipulate me, Inspector?" he asked. "That's possible," the inspector replied. "Or perhaps he simply wants the opportunity to explain his actions, to justify himself to someone who understands how he came to commit this terrible act. People under extreme stress often need validation, even when they know what they've done is wrong." "I will pay a visit," Miss Marple decided, "but on one condition, that I be able to speak with her completely in private. Lawyers and prison officers have their place, but if she truly wishes to communicate, she will need to know that her words will remain between us, except where legally necessary to disclose them." The inspector nodded, accepting this condition. 3 days later, Miss Marple found herself in a small visiting room at the county prison, sitting opposite Mrs. Millicent Blackwood. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had existed at the summer ball, perfectly coiffed and radiant with respectability, had completely vanished. What remained was a shadow of that person: unkempt hair, a face aged by stress, and eyes that blinked with an almost animalistic anxiety. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice a whisper. "No one else will want to talk to me. My husband has filed for divorce. My family has refused to admit he was ever related to me. I am completely alone. You are not entirely alone, as long as there is a possibility of understanding," Miss Marple replied, "although I must warn you that my understanding does not mean approval of what you have done. Can you tell me how you came to this point?" Mrs. Blackwood then began a confession that was, in many ways, more revealing than any police interrogation could have been. She spoke of how she had discovered the opportunity to embezzle church funds 3 years earlier, when she was reorganized as assistant treasurer. At first, the amounts were small, barely noticed. Then, as her fear of being discovered lessened, the amounts grew larger. "My husband never knew," she insisted. "He simply enjoyed an improved life without questioning where the money came from. I said I had inherited it from a distant aunt. He accepted it, as men accept such things when they don't require him to ask awkward questions." "And what led him to continue the robbery?" asked Miss Marple. "What made it so necessary?" "Humiliation," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her eyes filling with tears. "For years, my husband was treated as a social ornament. The men in the village barely acknowledged him. I was the one who provided the charitable contributions, the one who served on committees, the one with influential connections. And yet, he was the man. He was supposed to be the provider. So when I had the opportunity to give him what his own masculinity couldn't, I took it. I wanted him to be respected. I wanted the men in the village to see him as someone of means." "And when did Eleanor discover his thefts?" Miss Marple asked gently. The tears began to flow more freely. "It was awful. She came to me, so young, so sure of her own sense of righteousness. She told me I had to report what I'd found. I said she didn't understand that there were people who depended on money, that there were complicated reasons. She wouldn't listen to reason. She said she'd go to the inspector. She said it was her duty." "And at that moment he decided to kill her?" asked Miss Marple. "Not deliberately," protested Mrs. Blackwood. "Good heavens, Miss Marple. I didn't go into the greenhouse intending to kill her. I simply wanted to talk to her, to make her understand. When I saw her alone, I followed her. We argued. She was so relentless, so certain she was right. And then, when she said there was no way to stop me from reporting what I knew. When she said nothing I said would change her mind, something just gave way in me. "And the lawnmower?" asked Miss Marple. She was there, on the ground, where someone had left her after tending to the plants. She was just there. And when she turned around, when she said she was sorry but that she had to do the right thing, I just picked her up. I didn't think. I didn't plan. It just happened. And then, when she collapsed, when I saw the blood, all I could think was that I had made a terrible mistake. Miss Marple listened to all this with a carefully controlled expression of compassion. She knew it was important to allow Mrs. Blackwood to speak fully, to empty her soul of the guilt and remorse that clearly consumed her. "Do you regret it?" he finally asked. "More than words can express," Mrs. Blackwood replied. Every day since it happened, I've wished I could turn back time. I wish I could bring Eleanor back to life. I wish I could undo what I did, but I can't. And now I will suffer for it, as I deserve to suffer." Miss Marple remained silent for several minutes, considering the complexities of the confession. Finally, she spoke. "Mrs. Blackwood, what you have done is inexcusable. Murder cannot be forgiven simply because it was committed in a moment of panic or because it stems from understandable motivations. Eleanor Ashford lost her life. Her son lost his mother, Edmund. Blackwood and his family lost a life that could have been. These are the consequences of your action, and you must bear them as the weight they are." Mrs. Blackwood nodded, her face contorted. "I know, I accept it. However," Miss Marple continued, "I also believe there is redemption in the genuine acceptance of responsibility. If in her confinement, if in the years that remain to her, she can use her understanding of how she came to this point to help others avoid such tragedy, then perhaps her life can still have meaning. Not a meaning that erases what she has done, but meaning nonetheless." "Do you think it's possible?" asked Mrs. Blackwood, though her tone suggested she hardly dared to expect an affirmative answer. "I believe it is possible," Miss Marple replied, "but it will require more courage than she probably thinks she possesses. The courage to face each day what she has done. The courage to refuse self-pity. The courage to live within the limitations she has imposed upon herself." When Miss Marple left the prison that day, she carried with her the knowledge that she had witnessed not merely a crime of violence, but a rupture in the human soul. And although justice would be served, although Mrs. Blackwood would face the legal consequences of her actions, Miss Marple knew that the real punishment had already begun. The punishment of living with the knowledge of what one was capable of when despair and fear overcame moral principles. 6 weeks after Eleanor Ashford's death, St. Mary Mead had begun its slow transition back to a semblance of normality. Mrs. Blackwood had been sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence the judge had described as justly deserved for an act of premeditated violence committed to conceal years of theft and fraud. The news had been met by the town with a mixture of relief and melancholy, as if everyone were relieved the uncertainty was over, yet saddened by the knowledge that one of their own was capable of such depravity. Edmund Blackwood had formally claimed custody of Eleanor's son, who was born prematurely just a week after the murder. A boy he chose to name James, after Dr. Harrison, who had supported him unconditionally through the crisis. The child's presence transformed the small apartment above the bookstore where Edmund lived into something vibrant and purposeful. The young curator, who had been on the verge of being branded an accomplice in a family tragedy, had become a figure of pathos and redemption in the eyes of the town. Miss Marple was invited to be one of the first visitors to the newborn baby. Edmund greeted her at the door of his apartment, carrying little James with the careful clumsiness of someone still learning the mysteries of parenthood. "Miss Marple," he said with genuine warmth, "thank you for coming. I don't know what I would have done without your wisdom during these confusing times." "I simply observed what was in front of me," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic humility, as she sat down in the chair Edmund had prepared. "It is the child who deserves our support now. How is he feeding himself?" "Better every day," replied Edmund, gently passing the baby into Miss Marple's arms. "Dr. Harrison has been wonderful in providing medical advice, and Mrs. Prothero has insisted on sending prepared meals until I can manage better myself. The townspeople have been surprisingly understanding." Miss Marple watched the baby, who was sleeping peacefully, his small face unwrinkled by the worries that would inevitably surround his childhood. "Small towns have a wisdom that larger towns often lack," he observed. "They understand that scandals and tragedies are part of the fabric of human life. What matters is how a community responds to these events, whether it chooses to judge and exclude, or whether it chooses to support and restore." "Do you think James will have a normal life?" Edmund asked. "That the shadow of how he was conceived, his mother's death, won't consume him?" "That will depend largely on you," Miss Marple replied. "Children are remarkably resilient. If you raise him with love and honesty, if you teach him to value both compassion and fairness, then he has every chance of living a full life. The circumstances of his birth are just that, circumstances. They do not define who he will become." Later that week, Miss Marple was visited by Mr. Pemberton. The transformation in the man was remarkable. His prosperity had been replaced by a thoughtful sobriety. His suit was of the same quality as always, but he seemed to wear his wealth differently, as if he finally understood that material resources were merely tools, not proofs of worth. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I have come to inform you that I am withdrawing my business from St. Mary Mead. I have decided to sell my house and move to London, where I intend to devote myself to charitable causes, in particular those concerned with women's rights and legal reform." "What has prompted this drastic decision?" asked Miss Marple, although her expression suggested that she could already guess the answer. "Eleanor," he replied simply. "She came to me because she needed financial security, not because she loved me. And instead of feeling compassion for her plight, I felt resentment. I felt that she somehow owed me loyalty simply because I could provide her with what she wanted. It was criminal arrogance, Miss Marple. If I had been a better man, if I had seen Eleanor as a human being with her own needs and desires, perhaps she wouldn't have despaired the way she did. Perhaps she would have trusted me enough to tell me the truth about Edmund and the child." "Do you blame yourself for his death?" asked Miss Marple. "Partially," Mr. Pemberton replied. "Not for murdering her, of course. That blame belongs entirely to Mrs. Blackwood, but I do blame myself for creating the circumstances that made Eleanor vulnerable. If I had been kind, if I had asked, if I had listened, perhaps things would have been different. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mr. Pemberton, I think he's finding his conscience. That's a rare and valuable thing. Make good use of it. But it was Dr. Harrison who, in many ways, underwent the most profound transformation. He had begun spending regular time with Edmund, assisting with the care of baby James, teaching Edmund the rudiments of medicine, seemingly preparing him to assume the role of lay midwife that Dr. Harrison himself had held. More surprisingly, he had begun meticulously documenting every detail of the murder, the police procedures, and his own involvement in the case, with the evident intention of publishing the findings. Why? Asked Miss Marple when she visited his office and saw piles of notes scattered on his desk. Because I believe the case of Eleanor Ashford contains important lessons, Dr. Harrison replied. Lessons about how small moral transgressions can grow into great crimes. Lessons about how desperation can drive ordinary people to do extraordinary things. If I can help others understand these lessons, if I can prevent even one future murder through education, then Eleanor's sacrifice will not have been entirely in vain. And how do you feel about it? Asked Miss Marple. Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression tired but peaceful. I feel like I've been given a second chance to be of service in a way that goes beyond simply curing physical ailments. Eleanor came to me seeking guidance, looking for someone she could trust. I failed to provide what she truly needed, which was courage and support to do the right thing. But perhaps by sharing this story, I can help others provide that to people who are looking for it. As Miss Marple walked through the village in the following evenings, she observed these subtle changes in the fabric of St. Mary Mead. Edmund would pass across the central square pushing a blue prom, baby James sleeping under a white canopy. Mr. Pemberton would stop to converse with him, not the condescending wealthy benefactor, but a man simply concerned for the well-being of another. Dr. Harrison would walk toward the library with a bundle of papers under his arm, probably sharing his writings with the librarian for preservation. Even Mrs. Blackwood's space was gradually filled with new life. Her house was sold to a young family with 3 children, who brought laughter and energy to a place that had been hardened by shame. The stolen money was recovered from her bank accounts and restored to the church, allowing Mrs. Prothero to fund the repairs she had planned years before. Miss Marple pondered this as she sat on her favorite bench in the garden, watching the roses she had patiently cultivated for years bloom in the summer heat. Life, she thought, was like these roses. It needed to be carefully nurtured, the weeds that threatened to choke it removed, and protected from the pests that sought to destroy it. But if it was done properly, if it was done with love and understanding, then even from the darkest earth, even after the most brutal violence, beauty could bloom again. Autumn had arrived at St. Mary Mead with a melancholic beauty. The leaves were turning deep gold and red, the nights were growing longer, and there was a quality of introspection that seemed to permeate even the air. Miss Marple, who loved this season for its reminder of the cycles of life and death, had spent much of September in her garden, preparing her plants for the coming winter. It was a particularly cool afternoon when she received an unexpected letter from Mrs. Millicent Blackwood in prison. Miss Marple held the envelope in her hands for several minutes before opening it, considering whether she really wished to reread the thoughts of a woman who had committed murder. But her understanding of human nature dictated that she open the letter, that she listen to what Mrs. Blackwood had to say. The letter was written in careful handwriting, the work of someone who had little more than time to reflect. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I am writing from my cell in the county jail, where I have spent the last 3 months contemplating the terrible act I committed. I have had ample time to think, more than probably any one person deserves. I've been reading about your life, Miss Marple. The people in prison speak of you as a woman of great wisdom. They talk about how you solved the mystery of Eleanor Ashford, not through violence or accusation, but through patient observation and an understanding of human nature. I wanted to write to ask for your forgiveness. I don't expect you to grant it. I don't deserve such mercy. But I wanted you to know that I've come to understand, thanks in part to our conversations, that my actions weren't simply about stealing church funds or protecting my secrets. It was about a fundamental inability to accept that life didn't always give me what I thought I deserved. I have spent my years in this prison, teaching other women to read and write. It is humble work, but it gives me purpose. When I teach an illiterate woman to write her own name, I see in her face a transformation I once hoped to experience with money and position. I have come to understand that true satisfaction comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we contribute. If my story, if this letter, could serve as a warning to others of the dangers of dishonesty and despair, then perhaps my existence in this prison would have gained some meaning. With deep remorse, Millicent Blackwood, Miss Marple, read the letter several times, each reading revealing deeper layers of genuine remorse. It wasn't the letter of someone seeking forgiveness for sentimental reasons. It was the letter of someone who had genuinely undergone a transformation of consciousness, who had come to understand the moral implications of their actions in a way that takes most people a lifetime to grasp. He decided to respond, "Dear Mrs. Blackwood, I have received your letter and have carefully considered your words. I am writing not to grant you the forgiveness you claim you do not deserve, but to acknowledge that you have demonstrated the most difficult ability any human being can possess, the ability to clearly see one's own faults. We have made a common mistake in our societies. We believe that forgiveness is something that must be granted or withheld by those we have wronged. But I believe that true forgiveness comes from within, from accepting that we have failed, that we are capable of great evil, and yet we choose to transform ourselves nonetheless. Her work teaching other women suggests that she has already found forgiveness not from me, but from the greater forces in the universe that propel human beings toward redemption. Continue this work. Let her life in prison be not a punishment, but an opportunity to build something positive from the ruin of her own choices. With sincere respect, Jane Marple." When Miss Marple sent the letter, she felt that something inside her had been resolved. The case of Eleanor Ashford, which had begun as a murder mystery, had evolved into something deeper, an exploration of how crime and redemption, guilt and regret are interwoven into the fabric of human nature. It was this reflection that led Miss Marple to accept an unexpected request from Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard. He wanted her to speak to a group of police officers about the case, sharing her methods of observation and her understanding of criminal psychology. "I would prefer not to," Miss Marple initially replied. "I have done what I believed was my duty. I have no desire to become a public figure." But Miss Marple, insisted Inspector Craddock, has an extraordinary gift for understanding people. So many of our officers approach crimes solely from a forensic perspective, looking for physical evidence. They almost never consider the psychological understanding of the criminal. If you could teach them to observe as you observe, they could solve cases that would otherwise remain unsolved. Finally, she gave in, and on a cold October afternoon, Miss Marple found herself sitting in a conference room at Scotland Yard, surrounded by skeptical police officers, some of whom obviously doubted that an elderly woman from a small town had anything meaningful to teach them. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice small but clear, "I have spent more than 50 years observing the people in my town. I have seen Shakespearean dramas unfold in the drawing rooms of country houses. I have seen the potential for Greek tragedy in ordinary family conflicts, and I have learned that crime, at its core, is simply the result of human nature under extreme stress. Most criminals are not monsters," he continued. "They are ordinary people who have been thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who have made desperate choices, and who are often surprised by their own actions. If you can learn to see criminals in this way, if you can penetrate the mask of respectability that almost all of us wear, then you will have a tool more powerful than any forensic analysis, an understanding of human motivation." He went on to describe the case of Eleanor Ashford, not as a conventional murder mystery, but as a study of how petty theft can escalate, how desperation can overcome morality, how ordinary people can be capable of terrible acts when they see their lifestyle threatened. "And how did you know it was Mrs. Blackwood?" asked one of the younger officers. "I didn't know for sure," Miss Marple answered honestly, "but I observed her behavior. I observed the stain of soil on her dress. I observed the orchid in the greenhouse, which came from a collection she had gained access to through Dr. Harrison. I observed how her eyes quickly assessed each situation, calculating the risk, and when all these observations were put together, they formed a pattern that indicated guilt. So it's simply observation." Another officer asked, "Nothing more complicated than that. Observation is an art, not a science," Miss Marple replied. "It requires patience. It requires that you be willing to wait, to listen, to allow people to reveal themselves through their actions and behaviors. It requires empathy, because to understand why someone has committed a crime, you must be able to get inside their mind, to understand their motives, even when those motives are unacceptable." When Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, she realized that the village had changed in her eyes, not because the village itself had changed, but because she had seen more deeply into the nature of her own community. She had seen that even those who seemed most respectable could harbor darkness. She had seen that tragedy could sprout from the smaller seeds, and she had seen that redemption was possible if people were truly willing to face their own failings and transform themselves. November brought the first frosts to St. Mary Mead, transforming the landscape into a painting of greys and whites. Miss Marple's roses had withered, their petals falling like unspoken confessions onto the dark earth. It was in this season of decline and preparation for winter rest that Miss Marple received an invitation to a small, private dinner at Edmund Blackwood's house. "I wanted to thank you properly," Edmund explained when he greeted her at the door. "Not simply for solving the crime, although that was crucial, but for your understanding, for your kindness during the times when I felt most desperate. I wanted us to celebrate what has emerged from the chaos, a new life, a new hope." The house had been transformed since Miss Marple's last visit. The walls now displayed carefully arranged books, not just on medieval liturgy and church history, but also on parenting, child-rearing, and philosophy. In the corner of the living room, a beautiful wooden cradle held little James, who was now 3 months old and had begun to display the distinctive personality that Edmund said he had inherited from his mother. Dr. Harrison and Mr. Pemberton were also present, united in a companionship that would have seemed impossible months before. It was Dr. Harrison who proposed the toast. To Miss Marple, he said, raising his glass, who taught us that justice is not simply about punishing the guilty, but about understanding how good people can be led to do bad things, and how even those who have committed the worst acts can find redemption. To Miss Marple, echoed the men, and she raised her own glass with a modesty that could not be false. You are the ones who have found your own path, he replied. I simply observed. It was your courage that allowed the transformation. Later that evening, after Dr. Harrison and Mr. Pemberton had left, Miss Marple spent time holding little James while Edmund made tea in the kitchen. The baby was surprisingly calm, his small eyes observing Miss Marple's face with the earnestness that babies often possess, as if seeing through the superficial layers of age and experience to something more fundamental. Do you think he'll be able to live a normal life? Edmund asked, bringing in the tea. That he won't be completely defined by the circumstances of his birth. We are all partly defined by our circumstances, Miss Marple replied, handing the baby back to his father. But we also have the capacity to define our own lives through our choices. Your son will have the advantage of a father who loves him deeply, a community that has embraced him, and his mother's story, which, although tragic, was also remarkable. That is more than many children have. Have you forgiven Mrs. Blackwood? Edmund asked suddenly. For Eleanor's death? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Forgiveness is a complicated concept. Mr. Blackwood, I don't believe it's my place to forgive Mrs. Blackwood for what she did to Eleanor. That's a matter between Mrs. Blackwood, her own conscience, and the greater forces that govern the universe. What I do believe is that I've come to understand why she did it, and that understanding, that recognition of our shared humanity even in our worst actions, is perhaps a deeper kind of forgiveness than mere absolution. She seems very wise, Edmund observed. I am not wise, Miss Marple replied. I am merely old, and age provides the opportunity to see recurring patterns, to understand that human stories, though superficially different, contain universal themes. Passion, despair, ambition, love, these are played out again and again in human life, simply in different settings. As Miss Marple walked home that evening, she passed St. Mary Mead Church. The lights inside were dimmed, but still burning, as if the church itself were keeping watch over the village. She thought of Eleanor Ashford, who had died trying to do the right thing, who had been murdered for her integrity. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, who would probably spend the rest of her life in prison, but who, according to her letter, had found a kind of purpose. She thought of Edmund, who had been brought to the most extreme circumstances, but had emerged stronger. And she thought of little James, who would carry his mother's story with him, a story that could serve as either a warning or an inspiration, depending on how he chose to interpret it. The case of Eleanor Ashford was officially over. Mrs. Blackwood's trial had concluded with a conviction for second-degree murder. The sentence of life imprisonment had been considered fair by most of the town, although some whispered that Mrs. Blackwood deserved the death penalty for her crime. But Miss Marple, who had seen enough of human violence to understand its corrosive nature, believed that justice did not require the state to simply mimic the crimes of criminals. What the case had revealed, however, was something far deeper than a simple murder. It had revealed how crime doesn't arise in a vacuum, but rather emerges from an ecosystem of ambition, desperation, unspoken secrets, and people's inability to truly communicate with one another. It had revealed how a community that seemed unshakable in its respectability contained fundamental flaws, fractures that needed mending. The case had also taught Miss Marple something she already knew. but which never ceased to amaze her, that the human capacity for transformation was almost limitless. That even those who had committed the most terrible acts could find redemption if they chose to confront their own failings. That even those who had lived lives of blissful ignorance could awaken to. When she arrived home, she lit a candle in her drawing-room window, an old custom her ancestors had maintained. As the flame flickered, Miss Marple sat down in her favorite chair and took out her writing paper. She had a letter to write, this time to Inspector Craddock, who had asked for her advice on a new case that had arisen in a village not far from St. Mary Mead. But, as she held her quill over the blank paper, Miss Marple simply remained silent, pondering. She wasn't sure if she wished to involve herself in another mystery. The case of Eleanor Ashford had shown her both the rewards and the costs of seeking the truth. She had seen how the truth could heal, but also how it could shatter, how it could set free, but also how it could imprison. Finally, he wrote a simple reply that he would consider her request, but that he needed rest first. He needed time to allow recent events to settle in his mind, to process all that he had seen and learned. He needed to remember why he had chosen to live in a small town in the first place, not to actively participate in its dramas, but simply to observe, learn, and perhaps occasionally serve when justice required it. When she finally went to bed that night, Miss Marple slept soundly, without dreams. The sleep of someone whose conscience was clear, whose understanding of human nature had deepened, and who had done what she could to serve justice and mutual understanding in her little corner of the world. December arrived in St. Mary Mead with the promise of Christmas. The village shops began to be decorated with holly garlands and red ribbons. The church bells rang more frequently, calling the faithful to Advent services, and in the homes of the community, festive meals were prepared and gifts were wrapped with the meticulous care that the Christmas season inspired. Miss Marple watched all this from her garden, where her plants lay dormant beneath a light dusting of morning frost. The summer's crime seemed distant now, almost as if it had happened in another time, another world. And yet its echoes lingered, quietly transforming the fabric of the community in ways that would only become fully apparent with time. It was on Christmas Eve that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Edmund Blackwood arrived at her door with little James in his arms. The baby now covered with a white wool coat that made him look like a small walking snowball. "I thought you might like to meet little James formally during the festive season," Edmund explained, his eyes shining with something Miss Marple recognized as genuine peace. "I would like you to know that he has thrived under our care. Look at him. Isn't he healthy?" The baby certainly looked good. His cheeks were chubby, his eyes shone with that particular sparkle that babies possess. And when Miss Marple held him, he smiled the toothless grin that characterizes the first few months of life. "He's a beautiful boy," said Miss Marple, gently rocking the baby. "And how is he adjusting to fatherhood?" "Better every day," Edmund replied. "There are still moments of uncertainty. Nights when I can't sleep because I'm worried about whether I'm doing things right. But Dr. Harrison has been wonderful, giving me practical advice, and the community has been surprisingly supportive. Mrs. Prothero sent a gift of clothing last month. The vicar has offered me spiritual support. Even some of the older women in the village have visited to offer their help." "Have you heard from Mrs. Blackwood?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. Edmund seemed surprised by the question. "A letter, about a month ago," he replied. "It was unexpectedly kind. She apologized for what she had done, though she acknowledged that forgiveness was something she didn't deserve. She wrote that she hoped little James could live a better life than the one her death had almost destroyed. And how did he respond? I wrote to her saying that James would know his mother's story, but that it would be a story of someone who chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult. I have decided that I will not hide the truth about his birth or how his mother died, but I also will not allow that truth to define him. I hope that one day, when he is old enough to understand, he can see that even in the most tragic circumstances, there is an opportunity for redemption and transformation. Miss Marple nodded approvingly, perceiving in Edmund a man who had matured considerably under the pressure of circumstances. That's remarkable wisdom for someone so young. Mr. Blackwood, it seems the summer of tragedy has also provided an opportunity for growth. After Edmund left, Miss Marple spent the afternoon writing. She wrote letters to various correspondents, including one to Inspector Craddock, formally accepting his request that she continue to assist in criminal investigations as required by the justice system. She also wrote to Mr. Pemberton, who was establishing a charity in London, offering her moral support even though she could not participate practically in its activities. And she wrote to Dr. Harrison, thanking him for his dedication to understanding not only the medical aspects of crime, but also its psychological dimensions. But the most important letter was one she wrote to Mrs. Blackwood from prison. In it, she explained that while she couldn't grant forgiveness for Eleanor's murder, she could offer her acknowledgement of her genuine remorse. She wrote that she believed her work teaching other women in prison was a meaningful act of redemption, that her life, though confined, could have purpose. And she wrote that Eleanor's son would grow up knowing that his mother had tried to do the right thing, even when it was costly, and that this legacy was one of which Eleanor could be proud. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple attended the Christmas service at St. Mary Mead Church. The church was full of villagers, some of whom had been absent from regular services for years. It seemed as if tragedy had reaffirmed for them the importance of community, of shared connection, of the customs that bound them together. As the vicar began to read the Christmas story, Miss Marple reflected on how the story of Jesus, like all truly meaningful stories, was fundamentally a story of redemption, about how darkness could be pierced by light, about how death could be transformed into the promise of new life, about how even in the most desperate moments, hope persisted, as the hymns were sung and the candles flickered in the darkness of Christmas night. Miss Marple felt something inside her finally settle. The case of Eleanor Ashford had been more than a mystery to be solved. It had been a catalyst for the transformation of an entire community. And though Eleanor herself would not be around to see the results of her actions, though her death had been tragic and unnecessary, her legacy of honesty and courage would live on in the son she had left behind, and in the way her sacrifice had transformed those around her as she walked home from the service. Miss Marple noticed that the snow had begun to fall gently. The white flakes blanketed the village like a blessing, transforming every flaw, every stain, every reminder of darkness under a layer of white purity. It was, she thought, a fitting reminder that even after the most terrible deeds, after the most brutal crimes, there was the possibility of new beginnings, of transformation, of hope. When she finally retired to bed that night, Miss Marple slept the sleep of someone whose conscience was at peace, whose understanding of human nature had been deepened and broadened by the events of the summer. And in her dreams, she saw roses blooming in winter, children laughing in the rain, and women in prisons finding redemption through kindness to others. The case of Eleanor Ashford was over, but her legacy, like that of all truly significant events, would continue to resonate through the years to come. A reminder to those who witnessed it that life, though fragile and sometimes terrible, also held within it a capacity for beauty, transformation, and eternal redemption.